You're listening to Midwest Coven Cast presents Weekend Reads. I'm Marilyn of Midwest Coven Cast, and each week I will be reading to you, dear listeners, occult works that are in the public domain. All of this I do with the goal of helping each of us grow in our knowledge and practices. Here in Season 1, we will be making our way through Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy or magic, published in 1531. I hope you enjoy this week's installment. Chapter 61. Of the forming of man, of the external senses, also those inward, and the mind, and of the threefold appetite of the soul, and passions of the will. It is the opinion of some divines that God did not immediately create the body of man, but by the assistance of the heavenly spirits compounded and framed him, which opinion Alcinous and Plato favor, thinking that God is the chief creator of the whole world, and of spirits, both good and bad, and therefore immortalized them, but that all kinds of mortal animals were made only at the command of God. For, if he should have created them, they must have been immortal. The spirits, therefore, mixing earth, fire, air, and water together, made of them all, put together one body, which they subjected to the service of the soul, assigning in it several provinces to each power thereof. To the meaner of them, mean and low places, as to anger, the midriff, to desire, the womb, but to the more noble senses, the head, as the tower of the whole body, and then the manifold organs of speech. They divide the senses into the external and internal. The external are divided into 5, known to everyone, to which there are allotted 5 organs or subjects, as it were, foundations, being so ordered that they which are placed in the more eminent part of the body have a greater degree of purity. For the eyes, placed in the uppermost place, are the most pure, and have an affinity with the nature of fire and light. Then the ears have the second order of place and purity, and are compared to the air. The nostrils have the third order, and have a middle nature betwixt the air and the water. Then the organ of tasting, which is grosser, and most like the nature of water. Last of all, the touching is diffused through the whole body, and is compared to the grossness of earth. The more pure senses are those which perceive their objects farthest off, as seeing and hearing. Then the smelling, then the taste, which doth not perceive, but that which is nigh. But the touch perceives both ways, for it perceives bodies nigh, and as sight discerns by the medium of the air, so the touch perceives by the medium of a stick or pole. Bodies hard, soft, and moist. Now the touch only is common to all animals, and it is most certain that man hath this sense, and in this and taste he excels all other animals. But in the other 3 he is excelled by some animals, as by a dog who hears, sees, and smells more acutely than man, and the lynx and eagles see more acutely than all other animals and man. Now the interior senses are, according to Averroes, divided into 4, whereof the first is called common sense, because it doth first collect and perfect all the representations which are drawn in by the outward senses. The second is the imaginative power, whose office is, seeing it represents nothing, to retain those representations which are received by the former senses, and to present them to the third faculty of inward sense, which is the fantasy, or power of judging, whose work is also to perceive and judge by the representations received, what, or what kind of thing, that is of which the representations are, and to commit those things which are thus discerned and adjudged to the memory to be kept. For the virtues thereof, in general, are discourse, dispositions, persecutions, and flights, and stirrings up to action, but in particular the understanding of intellectuals, virtues, the manner of discipline, counsel, and election. This is that which shows us future things by dreams, whence the fancy is sometimes named the fantastical intellect. For it is the last impression of the understanding, which, as saith Iamblichus, is that belonging to all the powers of the mind, and forms all figures, resemblances of species, and operations, and things seen, and sends forth the impressions of other powers unto others. And those things which appear by sense it stirs up into an opinion. But those things which appear by the intellect, in the second place, it offers to opinion. But of itself it receives images from all, and by its property doth properly assign them, according to their assimilation. It forms all the actions of the soul, and accommodates the external to the internal, and impresses the body with its impression. Now these senses have their organs in the head, for the common sense and imagination take up the two forward cells of the brain. Although Aristotle placeth the organ of the common sense in the heart, but the cognitive power possesseth the highest and middle part of the head, and lastly, the memory, the hindmost part thereof. Moreover, the organs of voice and speech are many, as the inward muscles of the breast betwixt the ribs, the breasts, the lungs, the arteries, the windpipe, the bowing of the tongue, and all those parts and muscles that serve for breathing. But the proper organ of speech is the mouth, in which are framed words and speeches, the tongue, the teeth, the lips, the palate, and the like. Above the sensible soul, which expresseth its powers by the organs of the body, the incorporeal mind possesseth the highest place, and it hath a double nature, the one which inquireth into the causes, properties, and progress of those things which are contained in the order of nature, and is content in the contemplation of the truth, which is, therefore, called the contemplative intellect. The other is a power of the mind which, discerning by consulting what things are to be done and what is to be shunned, is wholly taken up in consultation and action, and is therefore called the active intellect. This order of powers, therefore, nature ordained in man, that by the external senses we might know corporeal things, and by those internal the representations of bodies, as also things abstracted by the mind and intellect, which are neither bodies nor anything like them. And according to this threefold order of the powers of the soul, there are three appetites in the soul. The first is natural, and is an inclination of nature unto its end, as of a stone downward, which is in all stones. Another is animal, which the sense follows, and it is divided into that irascible and that concupiscible. The third is the intellectual, and is called the will, differing from the sensitive faculty in that the sensitive is, of itself, of those things which may be presented to the senses, desiring nothing unless in some manner comprehended. But the will, although it be of itself of all things that are possible, yet, because it is free by its essence, it may be also of things that are impossible, as it was in the devil, desiring himself to be equal with God, and therefore is altered and depraved with pleasure, and with continual anguish, whilst it assents to the inferior powers. Whence, from its depraved appetite, there arise four passions in it, with which, in like manner, the body is affected sometimes, whereof the first is called oblectation, which is a certain quietness or ascension of the mind or will, because it obeys, and not willingly consents to that pleasantness which the senses hold forth, which is, therefore, defined to be an inclination of the mind to an effeminate pleasure. The second is called effusion, which is a remission of or dissolution of the power, viz., when beyond the oblectation, the whole power of the mind and intention of the present good is melted and diffuseth itself to enjoy it. The third is vaunting and loftiness, thinking itself to have attained to some great good, and the enjoyment of which it prides itself and glorieth. The fourth and the last is envy, or a certain kind of pleasure or delight at another man's harm without any advantage to itself. It is said to be without any advantage to itself, because if any one should, for his own profit, rejoice at another man's harm, this would be rather out of love to himself than out of ill will to another. And all these four passions, arising from a depraved appetite for pleasure, the grief or perplexity itself, doth also beget very many contrary passions, as horror, sadness, fear, and sorrow at another's good without his own hurt, which we call envy, or sadness at another's prosperity, just as pity is a certain kind of sadness at another's misery. Chapter 62. Of the passion of the mind, their original source, differences, and kinds. The passions of the human mind are nothing else but certain motions or inclinations proceeding from the apprehension of anything, as of good or evil, convenient or inconvenient. Now, these kind of apprehensions are of three sorts, viz., sensual, rational, and intellectual. According to these three are three sorts of passions in the soul, for when they follow the sensitive apprehension, then they respect a temporary good or evil, under the notion of profitable or unprofitable, or delightful or offensive, and are called natural or animal passions. When they follow the rational apprehension, and so respect good or bad under the notions of virtue or vice, praise or disgrace, profitable or unprofitable, or honest or dishonest, they are called rational or voluntary passions. When they follow the intellectual apprehension, and respect good or bad under the notion of just or unjust, or true or false, they are called intellectual passions, or syncrasies. The faculty of choosing from comparison. Now, the subject of the passions of the soul is the concupitive power of the soul, and is divided into the concupiscible and the irascible, and both respect good and bad, but under a different notion. For when the concupiscible power respects good and evil absolutely, love or lust, or, on the contrary, hatred is caused. When it respects good, though absent, so desire is caused, or evil, though absent or at hand, and so is caused horror, flying from, or loathing. Or, if it respects good, though present, then there is caused delight, mirth, or pleasure. But if evil, though present, then sadness, anxiety, or grief. But the irascible power respects good or bad under the notion of some difficulty, to obtain the one or to avoid the other, and this sometimes with confidence. And so there is caused hope or boldness, but when with diffidency, then despair and fear. But when that irascible power riseth into revenge, and this be only about some evil past, as it were, of injury or hurt offered, there is caused anger. And so we find 11 passions in the mind, which are love, hatred, desire, horror, joy, grief, hope, despair, boldness, fear, and anger. Chapter 63. How the passions of the mind change the proper body by changing its accidents and moving the spirit. The fantasy, or imaginative power, hath a ruling power over the passions of the soul when they follow the sensual apprehension. For this doth, of its own power, according to the diversity of the passions, first of all change the proper body with a sensible transmutation, by changing the accidents in the body, and by moving the spirit upward or downward, inward or outward, and by producing diverse qualities in the members. So in joy, the spirits are driven outward, in fear, drawn back. In bashfulness are moved to the brain. So in joy, the heart is dilated outward by little and little. In sadness is constrained by little and little inward. After the same manner, in anger or fear, but suddenly. Again, anger or desire of revenge produceth heat, redness, a bitter taste, and a looseness. Fear induceth cold, trembling of the heart, speechlessness, and paleness. Sadness causeth sweat and a bluish whiteness. Pity, which is a kind of sadness, doth often ill affect the body of him that takes pity, though it seems to be the body of another man so affected. Also, it is manifest that amongst some lovers there is such a strong tie of love that what the one suffers, the other suffers. Anxiety induceth dryness and blackness, and how great heats love stirs up in the liver and pulse. Physicians know, divining by the kind of judgment, the name of the one that is so beloved and in heroic passion. So Nostratus knew that Antiochus was taken with the love of Stratonica. It is also manifest that such like passions, when they are most vehement, may cause death. And this is manifest to all men, that with too much joy, sadness, love, or hatred, men many times die, and are sometimes freed from disease. And so we read that Sophocles and Dionysus, the Sicilian tyrant, did both suddenly die at the news of a tragical victory. So a certain woman, also seeing her son returning from the Canisian battle, died suddenly. Now, what sadness can do is known to all. We know that dogs oftentimes die with sadness because of the death of their masters. Sometimes also by reason of these like passions, long diseases follow, and are sometimes cured. So also some men, looking from a high place, by reason of great fear, tremble, are dim-sighted and weakened, and sometimes lose their senses. So fears and falling sickness sometimes follow sobbing. Sometimes wonderful effects are produced, as in the son of Croesus, whom his mother brought forth dumb, yet a vehement fear and ardent affection made him speak, which naturally he could never do. So with a sudden fall, oftentimes life, sense, or motion, on a sudden leave the members, and presently again are sometimes returned. And how much vehement anger, joined with great audacity, can do, Alexander the Great shows, who, being circumvented with a battle in India, was seen to send forth from himself lightning and fire. The father of Theodoricus is said to have sent forth out of his body sparks of fire, so that sparkling flames did leap out with a noise. And such like things sometimes appear in beasts, as in the horse of Tiberius, which was said to send forth a flame out of his mouth. Chapter 64. How the passions of the mind change the body, by way of imitation from some resemblance, of the transforming and translating of men, and what force the imaginative power hath, not only over the body, but the soul. The foresaid passions sometimes alter the body by reason of the virtue, which the likeness of the thing hath to change it, which power the vehement imagination moves, as in setting the teeth on edge at the sight or hearing of something, or because we see or imagine another to eat sharp or sour things. So he which sees another gape, gapes also, and some, when they hear any one name sour things, their tongues waxeth tart. Also, the seeing of any filthy thing causeth nauseousness. Many, at the sight of man's blood, fall into a swoon. Some, when they see bitter meat given to any, perceive a bitter spittle in their mouth. And William of Paris saith that he saw a man that at the sight of a medicine was affected as much as he pleased, when as neither the substance of the medicine, nor the odor, nor the taste of it came to him, but only a kind of resemblance was apprehended by him. Upon this account, some that are in a dream think they burn and are in a fire, and are fearfully tormented, as if they did truly burn, when as a substance of the fire is not near them, but only a resemblance apprehended by their imagination. And sometimes men's bodies are transformed and transfigured, and also transported. And this oft times when they are in a dream, and sometimes when they are awake. So Cyprus, after he was chosen king of Italy, did very much wonder at and meditate upon the fight and victory of bulls. And in the thought thereof did sleep a whole night, and in the morning he was found horned, no otherwise than by the vegetative power being stirred up by a vehement imagination, elevating cornific humours into his head, and producing horns. For a vehement cogitation, whilst it vehemently moves the species, pictures out the figure of the thing thought on, which they represent in their blood, and the blood impresseth the figure on the members that are nourished by it. As upon those of the same body, so upon those of another's. So the imagination of a woman with a child impresseth the mark of the thing longed for upon her infant, and the imagination of a man bit with a mad dog impresseth upon his body the image of dogs. So men may grow grey on a sudden, and some, by the dream of one night, have grown up from boys into perfect men. Hereto also may be referred those many scars of King Dagobertus, and marks of a Franciscus, which they received, the one whilst he was afraid of correction, and the other whilst he did wonderfully meditate upon the wounds of Christ. So many are transported from place to place, passing over rivers, fires, and unpassable places, viz., when the species of any vehement desire, or fear, or boldness are impressed upon their spirits, and being mixed with vapours, do move the organ of the touch in their original, together with fantasy, which is the original of local motion. Whence they stir up the members and organs of motion to motion, and are moved, without any mistake, unto the imagined place, not out of sight, but from the interior fantasy. So great a power is there of the soul upon the body, that whichever way the soul imagines and dreams that it goes, thither doth it lead the body. We read many other examples by which the power of the soul upon the body is wonderfully explained, as like that which Avicen describes of a certain man, who, when he pleased, could affect his body with the palsy. They report of Gallus Vibius, that he did fall into madness, not casually, but on purpose, for, whilst he did imitate madmen, he assimilated their madness to himself, and became mad indeed. And Austin makes mention of some men who could move their ears at their pleasure, and some that could move the crown of their head to their forehead, and could draw it back again when they pleased, and of another that could sweat at his pleasure. And it is well known that some can weep at their pleasure, and pour forth abundance of tears, and there are some that can bring up what they have swallowed, when they please, as out of a bag by degrees. And we see that in these days there are many who can so imitate and express the voices of birds, cattle, dogs, and some men, that they can scarce at all be discerned. Also, Pliny relates by diverse examples that women have been turned into men. Pontanus testifieth that in his time a certain woman called Caetava, and another one called Amelia, who, many years after they were married, were changed into men. Now, how much imagination can affect the soul, no man is ignorant. For it is nearer to the substance of the soul than the senses, and therefore acts more upon the soul than the sense doth. So women, by certain strong imaginations, dreams, and suggestions, brought in by certain magical arts, do often bind themselves into a strong affection for any one. So they say that Medea, by a dream, was filled with love for Jason. So the soul sometimes is, by a vehement imagination or speculation, altogether abstracted from the body, as Celsus relates of a certain presbyter, who, as often as he pleased, could make himself senseless, and lay like a dead man, so that when any one pricked or burnt him, he felt no pain, but lay without any motion or breathing. Yet he could, as he said, hear men's voices, as it were, afar off, if they cried out aloud. Chapter 65. How the passions of the mind can work of themselves upon another's body. The passions of the soul, which follow the fantasy, when they are most vehement, can not only change their own body, but can also transcend, so as to work upon another body, so that some wonderful impressions are thence produced in elements and intrinsical things, and they can thus take away or bring some disease of the mind or body. For the passions of the soul are the chiefest cause of the temperament of its proper body. So the soul, being strongly elevated and inflamed with a strong imagination, sends forth health or sickness, not only in its proper body, but also in other bodies. So Avicen is of the opinion that a camel may fall by the imagination of any one. So he who is bitten with a mad dog presently falls into a madness, and there appear in his body the shapes of dogs. So the longing of a woman with child doth act upon another's body when it signs the infant in the womb with the mark of the thing she longs for. So many monstrous generations proceed from monstrous imaginations of women with child, as Marcus Damascenus reports that at Petra Sanetta, a town situated upon the territories of Pisa, there was a wench presented to Charles, King of Bohemia, who was rough and hairy all over her body, like a wild beast, whom her mother, affected with a religious kind of horror by the picture of John the Baptist, which was in the chamber she occupied, afterwards brought her forth after this fashion. And this, we see, is not only in men, but also is done among brute creatures. So we read that Jacob, the patriarch, with his speckled rods set in the watering places, did discolor the sheep of Laban. So the imaginative powers of peacocks and other birds, whilst they be mating, impress a color upon their wings. Whence we produce white peacocks by hanging white clothes around the places where they mate. Now, by the above examples, it appears how the affection of the fantasy, when it vehemently intends itself, doth not only affect its own proper body, but also another's. So also the desire of witches to hurt doth bewitch men most perniciously with steadfast looks. To these things Evichan, Aristotle, Algazel, and Galen assent. For it is manifest that a body may most easily be affected with the vapor of another's diseased body, which we plainly see in the plague and leprosy. Again, in the vapor of the eyes, there is so great a power that they can bewitch and infect any that are near them, as the cockatrice or basilisk, which kill men with their looks. And certain women in Scythia, amongst the Illyrians and Triballi, killed whomsoever they looked angry upon. Therefore, let no man wonder that the body and soul of one may, in like manner, be affected with the mind of another, seeing the mind is far more powerful, strong, fervent, and more prevalent in its motion than the vapors exhaling out of bodies. Neither are there wanting mediums by which it should work, neither is another's body less subject to another's mind than to another's body. Upon this account, they say that a man by his affection and habit only may act upon another. Therefore, philosophers advise that the society of evil and mischievous men must be shunned, for their soul, being full of noxious rays, infects them that are near with a hurtful contagion. On the contrary, they advise that the society of good and fortunate men be endeavored after, because by their nearness they do us much good. For as the smell of musk doth penetrate, so something of either bad or good is derived from anything bad or good, by those that are nigh to them, which may continue a long time. Now, if the foresaid passions have so great a power in the fantasy, they have certainly a greater power in the reason, inasmuch as the reason is more excellent than the fantasy. And lastly, they have much greater power in the mind. For this, when it is fixed upon God for any good, with its whole intention, doth oftentimes affect another's body, as well as its own, with some divine gift. By this means, we read that many miracles were done by Apollonius, Pythagoras, Empedocles, Philolaus, and many prophets and holy men of our religion, which things we shall now consider. Chapter 66. That the passions of the mind are helped by a celestial season, and how necessary the constancy of the mind is in every work. The passions of the mind are much helped, and are helpful, and become most powerful by virtue of the heaven, as they agree with the heaven, either by any natural agreement, or by voluntary election. For as saith Ptolemy, he which chooseth that which is the better seems to differ nothing from him who hath this by nature. It conduceth, therefore, very much from the receiving of the benefit of the heavens in any work, if we shall by the heaven make ourselves suitable to it in our thoughts, affections, imaginations, deliberations, elections, contemplations, and the like. For such like passions do vehemently stir up our spirit to the likeness of the heavens, and expose us and our straightway to the superior significators of such like passions. And also, by reason of their dignity and nearness to the superiors, do much more partake of the celestials than any other material things. For our mind can, through imagination or by reason of a kind of imitation, be so conformed to any star as suddenly to be filled with the virtues of that star, as if it were a proper receptacle of the influence thereof. Now, the contemplating mind, as it withdraws itself from all sense, imagination, nature, and deliberation, and calls itself back to things separated, unless it exposeth itself to Saturn, is not of present consideration or enquiry. For our mind doth affect diverse things by faith, which is a firm adhesion, a fixed intention, and a vehement application of the worker or receiver to him that cooperates in any thing and gives power to the work which we intend to do, so that there is made, as it were, in us the image of the virtue to be received, and the thing to be done in us or by us. We must, therefore, in every work and application of things, affect vehemently, imagine, hope, and believe strongly, for that will be a great help. And it is verified amongst physicians that a strong belief and an undoubted hope and love towards the physician and medicine conduce much to health, yea, more sometimes than the medicine itself. For the same that the efficacy and virtue of the medicine works, the same doth the strong imagination of the physician work, being able to change the qualities in the body of the sick, especially when the patient placeth much confidence in the physician, by the means disposing himself for the receiving of the virtue of the physician and physic. Therefore, he that works in magic must be of a constant belief, be credulous, and not at all doubtful of obtaining the effect. For as a firm and strong belief doth work wonderful things, although it be in false works, so distrust and doubting doth dissipate and break the virtue of the mind of the worker, which is the medium betwixt both extremes, whence it happens that he is frustrated of the desired influence of the superiors, which could not be joined and united to our labors without a firm and solid virtue of our mind. Chapter 67. How the mind of man may be joined with the mind of the stars and intelligences of the celestials, and together with them impress certain wonderful virtues upon inferior things. The philosophers, especially the Arabians, say that man's mind, when it is most intent upon any work, through its passion and effects, is joined with the mind of the stars and intelligences, and being so joined is the cause of some wonderful virtue being infused into our works and things. And this because there is in the mind an apprehension and power of all things, so all things have a natural obedience to it, and of necessity an efficacy, and more to that which desires them with a strong desire. And according to this is verified the art of characters, images, enchantments, and some speeches, and many other wonderful experiments as to everything which the mind affects. By this means, whatsoever the mind of him that is in vehement love affects, hath an efficacy to cause love, and whatsoever the mind of him that strongly hates dictates, hath an efficacy to hurt and destroy. The like is in other things which the mind affects with a strong desire. For all those things which the mind acts and dictates by characters, figures, words, speeches, gestures, and the like, help the appetite of the soul and acquire certain wonderful virtues, as from the soul of the operator in that hour when such a like appetite doth invade it, so from the opportunity and celestial influence moving the mind in that manner. For our mind, when it is carried upon the great excess of any passion or virtue, oftentimes presently takes of itself a strong, better, and more convenient hour or opportunity, which Thomas Aquinas, in his 3rd book against the Gentiles, confesseth. So many wonderful virtues both cause and follow certain admirable operations by great affections in those things which the soul doth dictate in that hour to them. But know that such things confer nothing, or a very little, to the author of them, and to him which is inclined to them, as if he were the author of them. And this is the manner by which their efficacy is found out. And it is a general rule in them that every mind that is more excellent in its love and affection makes such like things more fit for itself, becoming efficacious to that which it desires. Every one, therefore, that is willing to work in magic must know the virtue, measure, order, and degree of his own soul in relation to the power of the universe. Chapter 68. How our mind can change and bind inferior things to the ends which we desire. There is also a certain virtue in the minds of men of changing, attracting, hindering, and binding to that which they desire, and all things obey them when they are carried into a great excess of any passion or virtue, so as to exceed those things which they bind. For the superior binds that which is inferior, and converts it to itself. And the inferior is, by the same reason, converted to the superior, or is otherwise affected and wrought upon. By this reason, things that receive a superior degree of any star bind or attract or hinder things which have an inferior, according as they agree or disagree amongst themselves. Whence a lion is afraid of a cock, because the presence of the solary virtue is more agreeable to a cock than to a lion. So a lodestone draws iron, because, in its order, it hath a superior degree of the celestial bear. So the diamond hinders the lodestone, because, in the order of Mars, it is superior to it. In like manner, any man, when he is opportunely exposed to the celestial influences, as by the affections of his mind and due applications of natural things, if he becomes stronger in a solitary virtue, he binds and draws the inferior into admiration and obedience, in the order of the moon to servitude or infirmities, in a saturnine order to quietness or sadness, in the order of Jupiter to worship, in the order of Mars to fear and discord, in a Venus order to love and joy, in a mercurial order to persuasion and obsequiousness, and the like. The ground of such a kind of binding is the very vehement and boundless affection of the soul with the concourse of the celestial order. But the dissolutions or hindrances of such a like binding are made by a contrary effect, and that more excellent or strong. For, as the greater excess of the mind binds, so also it looseth and hindereth. And lastly, when the mind feareth Venus, it opposes Saturn. When Saturn or Mars, it opposes Venus or Jupiter. For astrologers say that these are the most at enmity, and contrary the one to the other, i.e., causing contrary effects in these inferior bodies. For in the heavens, where there is nothing wanting, and where all things are governed with love, there can in no wise be hatred or enmity. Chapter 69. Of Speech and the Occult Virtue of Words. It being shown that there is a great power in the affections of the soul, you must know, moreover, that there is no less virtue in words and the names of things, and greatest of all in speeches and motions, by which we chiefly differ from the brutes and are called rational, not from reason, which is taken from that part of the soul which contains the affections, which Galen saith is also common to brutes, although in a less degree. But we are called rational from that reason, which is, according to the voice, understood in words and speech, which is called declarative reason, by which part we do chiefly excel all other animals. For logos in Greek signifies reason, speech, and word. Now a word is twofold, viz., internal and uttered. An internal word is a conception of the mind and motion of the soul, which is made without a voice. As in dreams, we seem to speak and dispute with ourselves, and whilst we are awake, we run over a whole speech silently. But an uttered word hath a certain act in the voice, and properties of locution, and is brought forth with the breath of a man, with opening of his mouth, and with the speech of his tongue, in which nature hath coupled the corporeal voice and speech to the mind and understanding, making that a declarer and interpreter of the conception of our intellect to the hearers, and of this we now speak. Words, therefore, are the fittest medium betwixt the speaker and the hearer, carrying with them not only the conception of the mind, but also the virtue of the speaker, with a certain efficacy unto the hearers, and this oftentimes with so great a power, that often they change not only the hearers, but also other bodies and things that have no life. Now those words are of greater efficacy than others, which represent greater things, as intellectual, celestial, and supernatural, as more expressly, so more mysteriously. Also those that come from a more worthy tongue, or from any a more holy order. For these, as it were certain signs and representations, receive a power of celestial and supercelestial things, as from the virtue of things explained, of which they are the vehicle, and from a power put into them by the virtue of the speaker. Chapter 70. Of the virtue of proper names. That the proper names of things are very necessary in magical operations, almost all men testify. For the natural power of things proceeds, first, from the objects to the senses, and then from these to the imagination, and from this to the mind, in which it is first conceived, and then is expressed by voices and words. The Platonists, therefore, say that in this very voice or word or name framed, with its articles, that the power of the thing, as it were some kind of life, lies under the form of the signification, first conceived in the mind, as it were through certain seeds of things, then by voices or words, as a birth brought forth, and lastly kept in writings. Hence magicians say that the proper names of things are certain rays of things, everywhere present at all times, keeping the power of things as the essence of the things signified, rules, and is discerned in them, and know the things by them, as by proper and living images. For as the great operator doth provide diverse species, and particular things by the influences of the heavens, and by the elements together with the virtues of planets, so, according to the properties of the influences, proper names result to things, and are put upon them by him who numbers the multitude of the stars, calling them all by their names, of which names Christ in another place speaks, saying, Your names are written in heaven. Adam, therefore, that gave the first names to things, knowing the influences of the heavens and properties of all things, gave them all names according to their natures, as it is written in Genesis, where God brought all things that he had created before Adam, that he should name them. And as he named anything, so the name of it was, which names indeed contain in them wonderful powers of the things signified. Every voice, therefore, that is significative, first of all signifies by the influence of the celestial harmony, secondly, by the imposition of man, although oftentimes otherwise by this than by that. But when both significations meet in any voice or name, which are put upon them by the said harmony, or men, then the name is with a double virtue, viz., natural and arbitrary, made most efficacious to act as often as it shall be uttered in due place and time, and seriously, with an intention exercised upon the matter rightly disposed, and that can naturally be acted upon by it. So we read in Philostratus that when a maid at Rome died the same day she was married, and was presented to Apollonius, he accurately inquired into her name, which being known, he pronounced some occult thing, by which she revived. It was an observation amongst the Romans in their holy rites, that when they did besiege any city, they did diligently inquire into the proper and true name of it, and the name of that god under whose protection it was, which being known, they did then with some verse call forth the gods that were the prosecutors of the city, and did curse the inhabitants of that city, so at length their gods, being absent, did overcome them, as Virgil sings, that kept this realm our gods, their altars have forsook, and blessed abodes. Now the verse with which the gods were called out, and the enemies were cursed, when the city was assaulted round about, let him that would know find it out in Livy and Macrobius. But also many of these, Serenus Simonicus, in his book of secret things, makes mention of. Chapter 71. Of many words joined together, as in sentences and verses, and of the virtues and astrictions of charms. Besides the virtues of words and names, there is also a great virtue found in sentences, from the truth contained in them, which hath a great power of impressing, changing, binding, and establishing, so that being used, it doth shine and more, and being resisted, is more confirmed and consolidated, which virtue is not in simple words, but in sentences, by which anything is affirmed or denied, of which sort are verses, enchantments, imprecations, deprecations, orations, invocations, obtestations, adjurations, conjurations, and such like. Therefore, in composing verses and orations for attracting the virtue of any star or deity, you must diligently consider what virtue any star contains, as also what effects and operations, and to infer them in verses, by praising, extolling, amplifying, and setting forth those things which such a kind of star is wont to cause by way of its influence, and by vilifying and dispraising those things which it is wont to destroy and hinder, and by supplicating and begging for that which we desire to get, and by condemning and detesting that which we would have destroyed and hindered, and after the same manner to make an elegant oration, and duly distinct by articles, with competent numbers and proportions. Moreover, magicians command that we call upon and pray by the names of the same star, or name to them to whom such a verse belongs, by their wonderful things, or miracles, by their courses, and ways in their sphere, by their light, by the dignity of their kingdom, by the beauty and brightness that is in it, by their strong and powerful virtues, and by such like things as these. As Psyche and Apuleius praise decrees, saying, I beseech thee by thy fruitful right hand, I entreat thee by the joyful ceremonies of harvests, by the quiet silence of thy chests, by the winged chariots of dragons, thy servants, by the furrows of the Sicilian earth, the devouring wagon, the clammy earth, by the place of going down into cellars at the light nuptials of Proserpina, and returns at the light inventions of her daughter, and other things which are concealed in her temple in the city of Eleusis in Attica. Besides, with the diverse sorts of the names of the stars, they command us to call upon them by the names of the intelligences ruling over the stars themselves, of which we shall speak more at large in their proper place. They that desire further examples of these, let them search into the hymns of Orpheus, than which nothing is more efficacious in natural magic, if they, together with their circumstances, which wise men know, be used according to a due harmony, with all attention. But to return to our purpose, such like verses, being aptly and duly made according to the rules of the stars, and being full of signification and meaning, and opportunely pronounced with vehement affection, as according to the number and the proportion of the articles, so according to the form resulting from the articles, and, by the violence of imagination, do confer a very great power in the enchanter, and sometimes transfers it upon the thing enchanted, to bind and direct it to the same purpose for which the affections and speeches of the enchanter are intended. Now, the instrument of enchanters is a most pure harmonical spirit, warm, breathing, living, bringing with it motion, affection, and signification, composed of its parts, endued with sense, and conceived by reason. By the quality, therefore, of this spirit, and by the celestial similitude thereof, besides those things which have already been spoken of, verses, also from the opportunity of time, receive from above most excellent virtues, and indeed are more sublime and efficacious than spirits and vapors, exhaling out of the vegetable life, such as herbs, roots, gums, aromatical things, and fumes, and such like. And therefore magicians, enchanting things, are wont to blow and breathe upon them the words of the verse, or to breathe in the virtue with the spirit, that so the whole virtue of the soul be directed to the thing enchanted. being disposed for the receiving of said virtue. And here it is to be noted that every oration, writing, and words, as they induce accustomed motions by their accustomed numbers, proportions, and form, so, besides their usual order, being pronounced or wrote backwards, move unto unusual effects. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Midwest Coven Cast Presents Weekend Reads. Join me next week for the next installment as we continue through Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy or magic. For more information about Midwest Coven Cast, you can visit our website at midwestcovencast.com. You can also follow us on social media at Midwest Coven Cast on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook, or at Midwest Coven on Twitter. We hope to see you there. Until next time, Coven, blessed be.